I'm super excited to show you some different darning techniques and hopefully get you excited to darn your socks and your sweaters and anything else that has holes in it, especially tea towels. Ooh, I see it's a very wet bank holiday Monday here. Ooh, that's exciting. I wish today was a holiday for me, but it is not, unfortunately. But I'm taking a holiday tomorrow. So Um, there are now I think six darning techniques in this book, and it's gonna be normally darning takes me an hour or two, especially because most of the holes that I have to darn are quite large. So I'm not gonna do a complete darn for you, but I thought what I would try to do is bring the book to life a little bit so you can see what it looks like to actually see a darn in progress, which hopefully will maybe demystify the process a little bit. In this book, there are, I think, 32 pages of darning instructions, and I took all the photographs. So there's so many step-by-step tutorials for everything you could possibly need. But I know that sometimes it's nice to actually have the real thing or to see a human being do it. So I just want to give you a quick sneak peek. I can't actually fit the entire book here with my camera, but this just gives you an idea of some of the photos that are in the book. So if you are interested, if you would like to see more beyond what I'm able to show you in an hour, definitely check out the book. It's not available until the 31st of May in the UK, but you can pre-order it now. So the first thing I'm going to show you is, I'm going to call this knit stitch darning. That's not really a thing, by the way. I just made that up tonight. I'm trying to make categories to make it easier to understand. So this type of darning only works if you have a knitted garment. And I'm going to clarify and say it only works if you can easily see the knit stitches. You can technically do this type of darning even on like t-shirts and really fine knit fabric, but I really don't recommend it. I want you to have a really positive mending experience, and you're not going to have one if you do knit stitch darning on something that fine. There are other ways to mend those types of fabrics. So the main one that I want to show you is Swiss darning, also known as duplicate stitch. I've also heard it called, um, there was another name for it that someone mentioned recently that I can't remember, but you might know another name for it once you see me do it. But essentially the difference between these two types of darning is that Swiss darning and duplicate stitch work for threadbare areas, and stocking web darning is the like extra level serious darning that you need when you have a hole. So I do not recommend stocking web darning if you are starting out. It is definitely an advanced technique, but it's excellent if you want to retain stretch and you want something invisible, or you're just up for a challenge. But Swiss darning is totally possible if you have the knit stitches intact. And I'm going to show you when you might use this. So this is a sock in terrible shape. These are woven darns that were created by former students of mine. And this is one of my secret tricks that when I have students who come to workshops without anything to mend, I give them my socks. And that's how I actually get a lot of my socks mended, by making my students do it. It's kind of like an evil plan that I have, but it works. But these dark blue areas are what I call the nylon skeleton. So this is when you have a sock that's made of wool or cotton and it's got some kind of synthetic material in it. So you can see it's threadbare, and the dark blue part is the nylon or synthetic content that stays behind, and it's much thinner, but it's not technically a hull. So especially here, you can see, do you see that structure there? So you've probably seen something like this on your own socks. So if you've got a situation like this, if you've got a sock where you can see the stitches this easily, or preferably something even thicker, so like a hand knitted sock would be perfect for this, or a hand knit sweater, or like a chunky knit kind of thing, that's perfect. You can totally use Swiss darning for this, and it'll still retain the same stretch properties. But I'm going to show you how to do it on a perfectly intact piece of fabric. so you understand how it works. And I'm just gonna zoom in so you can see it better. So this is a hand knitted piece of fabric. This was made using cotton yarn. Cotton's much easier to see the stitch definition. And this is some yarn that is exactly the same type as what this fabric is made of. It's just a different color. And I'm doing this upside down, so apologies if it doesn't look exactly how you might recognize it. So normally I like to start somewhere off to the side, and I should say too, for this, I'm using a blunt needle. So this does not have a point on it, and that's so I won't split the yarn into different strands. So I want to keep it intact. So the blunt needle helps with that. You don't have to use a blunt needle, but it'll make it much easier for you. You could get, these are usually sold in like wool shops, knitting shops, maybe in a haberdashery shop, and you might also find a tapestry needle is really useful for this. But usually knitters will have these. So I like to start somewhere off to the side. This is just to secure my yarn tail. So this is not the finished look, and this is what's known as the tail. So I'm just going to leave this little bit here, and by poking it in from the end, this just keeps it secure and out of my way so I don't get it tangled. And now if you look, now I'm upside down, but you can see there are these little like V kind of formations. So I'm just going to literally duplicate exactly what is already there. So that's why it's called duplicate stitch in the knitting world. So I'm going to come up behind here and I'm going to make the first leg of my V. See that? And then I'm going to poke down again. And now I'm going to come across horizontally. So I'm making a horizontal row here. So I want to come across the exact same part, just one stitch to the left. So this little V shape that I've just made is one knit stitch. And it's literally duplicating it. So if you look from the back, I haven't removed anything. There's no hole. And now I'm going to do the same thing again. I'm going to come up. So I'm coming up one full leg, and I'm going to come across behind the knit stitch above it. And now I'm going to come down again. When you're starting out, if you are not a knitter, sometimes it's hard to know where the knit stitches are. So it's really easy to accidentally put your needle in the wrong spot. Sometimes you might end up going up 2 stitches by accident, or you might do even a half stitch. So this is a half stitch. It's not a whole stitch. You want to make sure that you're coming up to the same height every time, and you're completely following that knit stitch pattern. And if you mess up, it's really easy to undo it. So there's no stress if you start doing Swiss darning and you're like, wait a minute, that doesn't look right. What's happened? So you can see it starts to make this really nice pattern that fits in with the existing stitching. If I had used the exact same yarn, so let's say you knitted a sweater, or you know the person who knitted your sweater and they have leftover yarn, then you can do a completely invisible Swiss darn if you wanted to. And then I'm going to come through the back here. And let's say that's the end of my row. Beautiful. And these kind of look like hearts too, so you could use that as a feature if you wanted to. Make all kinds of interesting designs. So now I want to come up to the next row, and I want to come up to one row above. So I'm poking my needle through here, and now I'm going to go in reverse. In the book, when I do this tutorial, I make a heart, a large heart, out of all these stitches, so you can actually see how it's done. But if you wanted to do something simpler, like a rectangle, like I'm doing here, it's even easier. Oh, now it gets interesting because I'm doing this upside down. Ah! Sorry, I just snorted. That is so rude. You should not snort when you're doing Facebook Live. It's real. I'm keeping it real, everybody, so you know. This adds a level of excitement for me. It's a good way to feel alive when it's like darning on stage. Woo, terrifying. And then you just keep following the knit pattern until you come to the point where you want to stop. And I'm making this taut, but not super tight. I'm trying to follow the original knit stitch pattern. So I want to make sure that it looks as close to the original stitches as possible. I don't want it too sloppy, but I'm definitely not going to pull too tight. Okay, and let's say this is the end here, and I'm just going to poke my needle through, and I'm going to come to the other side. Now this could be fine as is. I'm actually surprised it looks as neat and tidy. Usually you can see a tiny bit of the stitches underneath when you're doing it, so it makes it a little bit, it doesn't look as nice right after you darn it, but you can do a bit of stretching like this to adjust it, and then you can get your iron and you can steam it for a couple of seconds, and that does wonders. It will make it blend in much better. So if you try Swiss darning and you find that yours doesn't look as neat as this, don't be shocked and dismayed. Just know that usually it looks not quite perfect and it just needs a little bit of adjusting to get it to look just right. So now I'm going to flip this over, and you can see that's what it looks like on the back. And I'm going to pull this out. And now I can weave this in anywhere that I want to hide it in the back of the work. So let's say I'm going to go here and here, and I'm going to go here. And then I'm going to find my scissors, and then you can just snip kind of close to the edge like that. And you don't have to worry about it coming out. As long as you make enough stitches to secure it, it'll be fine. And then I can go ahead and weave this one in too later. So you can see sometimes, depending on where you weave it, sometimes it's visible from the front, sometimes it's not. If you find this is the case when you do it, you might want to go ahead and weave in back into this section, or you might want to weave your ends somewhere else where it's going to be less visible. So don't worry about this either. If this happens to you, you just go ahead and pull it out and then redo it. And I'm going to show you a trick. My students always think this is magical sorcery. If you find that your end is super short, your tail is super short, and it's shorter than your needle, and you can't thread your needle and get it back in, here is my magic trick. Instead of threading the needle and then adding the yarn, now let's see, I'm just going to check and see if that's visible. Yes, it is. I'm going to do every other stitch so it hides better. See, now I can't see the needle, so now I know it's going to be hidden. So what you can do in this case is put your needle in first and put it in halfway or part of the way, and then thread your needle. This is one of my tricks for fixing snags in clothing too. You put the needle in first without the thread and then thread it, and then you pull it through. And these tails can go anywhere. You can hide them in the work, you can hide them on the side, wherever is going to be best hidden and secured, and there's no knots. In darning, we don't do knots. And you'll find that the more you wash and wear your garment, the more this will kind of settle in and it'll become part of the fabric itself. So you don't have to worry about that. But this yarn is quite slippery because it's cotton. So if you've got something that's not wool and it doesn't have like a lot of grab to it, you might want to do a bit more weaving in at the tails before you actually snip off the ends, because that'll make sure that it's more secure. So that is Swiss darning. And I'll show you the heart from the book. So that's the heart that I show you how to create in the book. And you don't have to use this exact pattern. There's all kinds of different, you might have a much bigger threadbare area and need to make a much larger heart, but it gives you an idea of the kind of patterns and shapes you can create. And here's what that looks like on the back. So I just wove those ends in randomly. In the knitting world, duplicate stitch is also used to create patterns and add colors after the fact. So there is a type of knitting known as color work or intarsia where you can actually incorporate multiple colors at the same time. But if you're lazy and you like to cheat like me, or you find it easier to do it this way, you can use duplicate stitch to actually embellish your work. So you don't even need a hole. So it's actually a knitter's trick, but it works really well for mending if you've got those threadbare socks, or it's also really good for like threadbare elbows, for example, on a sweater before you've got a hole. And this is the sampler that's in the book. And this is the little section I've done with Swiss darning. So here I've created a heart. Here I've created a cross, a Swiss cross, which is one of my favorites because it looks like a first aid symbol. And here I've made little teeny tiny hearts. So that's each of these colors is just one little knit stitch in a different color, but they look like little miniature hearts. And you can see that's what it looks like from the back. Okay, now the next one I'm going to show you. This is the most important. So this is woven darning. And there are two main types of woven darns. There's also like 1,000 different combinations where you can combine the two. But the main differences are classic darning is usually done from the reverse side of the work, and surface darning is done from the right side or the surface. So I'll give you an example of what that looks like from the sampler. These two here, these were both, I traced 20-cent coins. Australian 20-cent coins are, about that big. And before I made my darns. So this one was worked from the other side, like this. So that's what I call a classic darn. And I made that name up, by the way, because all the other names for it are kind of cumbersome and gross. And it's just like the number one A+ super best darn. So I called it the classic darn. This is a surface darn because it's worked from the front. So you can see the back here. It's worked more like a patch from the surface. So the classic darn is, generally speaking, more integrated into the fabric. You can see a few of the little fluffy bits around here. Whereas the surface darn doesn't incorporate any of this fabric. So it's really only secured to the ends and wherever you weave in the edges. Classic darning is definitely the best if you want a subtle or invisible look, because aside from these little tiny stitches that pop up, you really only see your darning wherever the hole is. It's also kind of fun if you like to tell the story of your men's and you want to show what the original holes look like. Because with the classic darn, you can't, if you use a contrasting color, you can still see the original holes. With a surface darn, you can make really interesting shapes and much more deliberate geometric shapes. So it's a different look. Neither one is faster necessarily. They both have their different properties, I guess you could say. So it just kind of depends aesthetically what you're going for or which you prefer. You might want to try both. This one is a hybrid. So this is one where I worked it from the surface, but I turned it over and made these little loops that are a feature of the classic darn, so that I could still have that stability, but have a little bit more structure to it. This one was worked as a surface darn on the edge using gold metallic thread, one of my favorite things. I call it a chomp. So you can see the edges here are not incorporated into the darn, just that outside border. These were both surface darns. That is definitely one advantage of the surface darn, that you can create really interesting plaids and textures and patterns. But that also means you have far more ends to weave in. So there's a lot of things to consider. If you are overwhelmed by all the choices, maybe just have a look. I'm going to show you how I would get started, and then you can decide for yourself. But try both. I use both all the time. This is an example from the book that I demonstrated for the classic darn. So this is what it looks like on a knitted piece of fabric where the knit stitches are very obvious. But you can do darning on anything. You can use it on woven fabric. You can do it on tea towels. Anything you want. It doesn't matter. Here's what it looks like from the back. And you'll notice loops are a key feature of this darn. Main reason that we have the loops is to prevent shrinkage in the wash. Sometimes the yarn that you're darning with doesn't shrink at the same rate as the fabric that you're mending. So the loops make sure that you don't end up with puckery, tight darns on your fabric, pulling it unnecessarily and adding strain and also making it not look as nice. But the other advantage is that if your darning is a little bit sloppy, you can tug on these loops and adjust your darning so that so that the tension is correct. So that's definitely an advantage, but the loops are kind of ugly. So it's better if you are darning on the reverse side, like the classic darn, so they can be hidden away. I definitely put loops whenever I'm darning socks, especially. And I'm going to show you some examples of some socks that I have darned. So this is an example. This is my husband's sock that I darned using blue going in one direction and green going the other direction. And this is a classic darn. So you can see I darned it from the opposite side, and you can see that the darning is really visible wherever the hole was. So you can almost make out the shape of the original hole. I darned both of his socks at the same time, so you can see that this is what it looks like on the side that I worked on. Now it's also coming apart here. You can see the skeleton. So I need to darn it again, and that's okay. If you find that your darn is starting to fall apart and you need to add an extra, you can darn on top of existing darns. But this is what it looks like from the back, and this is what it looks like from the front. So that's a classic. And then here's some that I've done with surface darning. So this is a really fun sock that looks like a goldfish. It's a tabby sock. Super cute. So I would never ever let this one go to landfill. Oh, maybe I should turn it around so you can see it right side up. There you go. Beep, 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 beep. So I definitely wanted to keep this one going. So I darned extra thick on here. Normally, using too thick yarn is one of the big mistakes that people make when they're darning. You definitely want to go thinner. You want to match the original. But in this case, I always wear out the heels of my sock. It's just kind of a laughable thing. It happens all the time. So I treated this as like you would think of like granddad's elbow patch or something. So I tried as an experiment to do something a little bit extra strength. In this case, I used two different colors here. So I used orange going one direction, and I used this amazing pink going the other direction. So you get kind of a subtle effect that blends in, which I think is really cool. And I cannot feel this when I'm wearing it. So that is a success. This is another sock that I darned using surface darning. So again, same extra thick patches on the heels. Again, I don't normally advocate this, but it's good if you have the same problem as me. And you can see I've washed it a bunch of times and it's actually gotten a bit felted. It's gone fuzzy and it's super soft now. And here's one on the toe. So this yarn here is the same mending yarn that I've got halfway done on this sock. And you can see it's got many, many strands. So that's this yarn here. So it's almost like embroidery floss, and it's got 4 strands to it. Now, that can be, if you're doing a woven darn, that can be like an occupational hazard because if you were trying to weave through all of those strands, you can imagine how easy it would be to weave accidentally into the wrong thing. So I'm going to show you some tips and tricks for how to get past that in a second. And here's 2 more examples. This is the sock that I show in the demonstration in the book. So this is a surface darn, and because I'm keeping it real, this was meant to be a circle. It did not turn out as a circle, but that's fine. It doesn't have to be perfect. I just got it done. And here's one that I did where it was a little bit neater and tidier, and I made plaid. This is using the same mending yarn as that. You can get lots of different looks depending on how you do it. So if I can impart anything to you, I would say that darning can look so different depending on the yarn you use and the style you do. Don't give up if you think your darning looks ugly. There's a whole world out there just waiting to be discovered, and you will love it. Does anyone have any questions before I show you some live darning? No. Okay, great. I'll keep going. I am going to use this horrible, scary thing that I started earlier. And I'm going to, just for ease of color, going to get my favorite needle. This is my favorite needle. You might have a totally different favorite needle, but this is a darning needle, and it's got a sharp point, and it's really long, and it has an extra large eye. I used to use all kinds of needles, and then I started teaching workshops for kids, and I gave them long needles because it was easy for them to hold in their hands. And I found out that it's really great for students, and then I fell in love with it too. So now I just use extra long ones, but you don't have to. But if you are doing large darns like this, it's definitely good to have a needle that is wider than your darn so you can get through all the weaving in one pass. The other secret trick that I like is a needle threader. Not all needle threaders are created equal. If you have used one of those ones made of wire, they're terrible and they are just built to fall apart. They're the worst thing ever. I mean, they're kind of a necessary evil, I guess. But this one is my favorite for darning because it can accommodate extra large yarns and threads, mending yarn. So if I had to live without this, I would probably cry. So how you use a needle threader, you pop it into the needle first. So I've gone through the eye of the needle. And now I'm going to hook. Sorry, I'm trying to make sure. My camera is doing autofocus right now, so I'm sorry if it's making any of you ill. It's making me ill looking at it. Gosh, we keeping it real, Search Press? Yes, I think we are. And then you hook on the yarn and then you pull it through. And it just makes it so much easier. You don't need a needle threader. There's all kinds of tips and tricks for how to thread your needle without one. But I just find when I get the motivation to mend, anything that wastes time is going to demotivate me. So anything that I can do to keep going is going to be good. So that's why I love that needle threader. Now, this is step 1 of this darn. And look at that. You can't even tell where the strands are because that stuff is so horrible. So I'm going to show you how I get around it. So because we're starting, I'm just going to come off to the side here just to secure it. So this is not going to be permanent. I'm going to pull that out later. This is just to keep the yarn out of my way. And I'm going to leave a little bit of a tail that I can weave in later. And now, here is the magic trick. This is where you get your money's worth. I'm switching from the pointy end to the eye of the needle. This will keep me from accidentally splitting all of these fibers that I don't want to split. So now I'm going to go over and under, over, under, over, under, over, under. You don't have to go over, under. You could do every other one. You could make herringbone patterns. You could do any kind of thing you want. But usually I'm more about speed and I like to get things done. It depends on what I'm doing. I do private mending commissions, and sometimes those are extra fancy. So, sometimes I like to show off, but otherwise, if I'm just doing it for me, my socks, I will most likely just do whatever is going to get it done most quickly. Okay. Now, I'm going to take a stitch over here. So just underneath where this row is, just a tiny stitch. So you can see, like, I'm just taking like one little section of yarn there and then popping it through. And I'm not going to pull super tight. I don't want this to be super tight because what happens if you do a surface darn, if you pull too tight, your shape, your rectangle starts to go like this and it looks really wonky. And that's a common thing that happens when people do surface darns. So I'm just going to keep it snug, but not too tight. And now I'm going to push down all these bits here to keep it flat. That's the other hazard of surface darning, is that it wants to bow out and it wants to make like a rainbow shape, but you want to keep those rows as tight as possible. If you don't want to use a needle, if you're a knitter, you could use, like sometimes I keep bamboo knitting needles or cable needles, and I use those to poke them down. I've also used a chopstick. A chopstick works really well, but I find that things made of wood and bamboo are far better for this because they have a little bit more grab to them and they will push things down better. Like metal and plastic just aren't quite as good. But you can also just use the needle and just keep poking down the side of the needle. So now I've taken my stitch on the side, and now I'm going to go every other one. So I'm using, remember, the eye of the needle, not the pointy section, because I don't want to split those. And I'm going to go the opposite of what I did before. Now, normally, if I was doing a woven darn, I would not use that multi-stranded yarn because that would drive me crazy. But I'm showing you because in case you end up in this situation, this is how you get out of it. Because real life is very different to beautiful, perfect pictures that you see on Instagram. And I've had so many students say to me, I tried this thing that I saw on Instagram or Pinterest and it didn't work. And I go, oh no, I'm sorry. So I've tried to make it as easy as possible for you to not end up screaming and running away because I want you to mend. That's my goal. Okay, now. Okay. So now I've got to the end of that row and you can see how it's doing that like rainbow thing that I told you about where it's not even and compact. Okay, so now I'm going to go back in after I've taken my stitch and just go back and do the same thing that I did before and just poke those all back down. And then you just keep going until you get to the end. Flip it inside out, weave in the ends. The more rows you make, the less this will want to pack down. So just know that that's going to be part of it. And then you end up with something like the other socks that I showed you. So something like this. This is probably less compact than I would like. Generally speaking, when you're darning, you don't want to see any holes. You don't want any air in there. You want it as compact as possible, and you want those rows touching each other. They should all be like hugging, best friends. If you're darning a mohair blanket that's got a really loose weave, that's a totally different thing. So that's fine. You want to match the original weave. But this was more for demonstration. I probably, if I was doing this and actually going to wear it, and this wasn't just my demonstration sock, I would make these more closely packed together. So something more like that. Now, keep in mind, this has already been washed and worn many times too, so the definition is not quite there, but that's the ideal. That's what you're aiming for. You also don't have to make a square. Squares are technically less durable because they create a sharp edge that can easily split and put stress on the fabric. So squares are easy when you're lazy, and that's usually I'm lazy. But if you want something that's going to be longer lasting, it's better to darn like a circle shape or a wavy shape. Wonky shapes are actually better than perfect shapes when you're darning because they're stronger. So you might actually be making something wonky and worried about it, but you're actually doing something better in the long term. Now, I'm having a look at the questions. Are you able to show us how you started the green stitching? I would love to. I'm not sure that I'm going to have enough time, so I will try if I get some time after I show you the blanket stitch darning. Definitely in the book. The whole thing, step by step, is in the book in case I don't have time. And the other question says, I have a pile of socks that need darning, so we'll give this a go. What is under the sock that is padding it out? Oh, that's a great question. Okay, so thank you for reminding me. Now, um, for socks in particular, you don't need this for everything, but I like to use darning mushrooms. So this is one of my favorite mushrooms that looks like a toadstool. They're all different kinds. Like I have so many mushrooms, they're unbelievable. This is another one that I love. This one came from, I think, the Ukraine. I got it off eBay, but it's really cool, the painting on it, and it has needle storage inside. I like it because this one is quite wide and flat, and it has a flat bottom. So it's really good because I can actually darn on the surface and like hold this down to the tabletop while I'm working. So for when I'm darning socks, especially heels and toes, I prefer something more curved that will mimic the shape of my foot more naturally because when I remove the sock from it, it's going to be more like how my foot would actually sit and the stitching is going to look better when I'm wearing it. But for things like sweaters um, and things that are flatter, I like a flatter mushroom. So I actually have a whole collection and I use them for different things. It's like they all have little personalities. Generally speaking, for sweaters, I don't use a darning mushroom. I will just hold it in my hand. But I'm not the same as everyone, and I know a lot of my students prefer having a mushroom. So it really just is personal preference and it depends on the job that you're doing. If you don't have a darning mushroom or you don't want to buy one, you can use citrus fruit, another trick that's in my book. So you can use an orange or a lemon if you've got it. I know some students here that I heard about at the local university use potatoes to darn their socks, which is unbelievable. Um, but anything that you've got, really. I don't recommend a tennis ball because my students have said they can't remove the sock from the fuzz of the tennis ball afterwards, which is terrible. In this case, I've used the cap of a darning mushroom. So if you can imagine like this one, and I've just removed the stem and I've put that on the sock just for demonstration purposes. I could have used a mushroom, but it's easier to fit it in the frame this way. You could also use the lid of a jar. So in Australia, we've got Vegemite jars, which are perfect. They're awesome. They're like extra thick lid like that and flat. And I know Vegemite, controversial, right? Maybe I should be saying Marmite right now. I don't know what Marmite lids look like. I'm sorry. But you can use a jar lid if you've got one. So you can just improvise and find whatever you've got. And I know that Mender in Japan uses a soup ladle for hers as well. So anything that's going to replicate the shape of whatever is going to wear that garment eventually is good. So now I'm just going to move that over and I'm going to show you one of my favorites, which is blanket stitch darning. So blanket stitch is one of the most useful mending stitches that is out there. It's really good for stitching the edges of fabric, but generally speaking for like patches and things, but you can also use it to darn and fill out shapes. It's used in lace making techniques, which is really, really cool. So with blanket stitch darning, there are all different names for it. I went on a research deep dive and nearly drove myself mad. But the main two names that you will see associated with blanket stitch darning are Scotch darning and honeycomb darning. And the difference is that Scotch darning, generally speaking, looks like a rectangle. So it's in a brick formation. And you do it row by row all the way down. Whereas honeycomb darning is done in a spiral. And I'm just trying to find an example here. So honeycomb darning is exactly the same thing, but here's one example here where you do it in a spiral formation. So this was done with much thinner yarn than this was. So this is the same pair of socks that I darned with two different colors of yarn. Here's the other one. These are my husband's socks. Generally speaking, honeycomb darning is usually done on threadbare areas. So normally you will not find instructions for how to do it over a hole, but I have a secret trick in the book for how to do it. So you can also use it for a hole. This is honeycomb darning with one color of thread on a hole here on a sock. And here's one on a hole using variegated embroidery floss, which is amazing. I did not change those colors. Those colors came from this embroidery floss, which is hand dyed. So if you have access to variegated thread or yarn or sock yarn is perfect, especially variegated sock yarn. It makes it really fun. And if you're a lazy mender like me, then you don't have to change colors. And it also means fewer tails and ends to weave in, which is amazing. So I love this stuff. It makes me happy. So I'll just show you how this can look. Here's another example of a little miniature Scotch darn. So this was done in the brick formation. And in this case, I've made little tiny edge stitches that I've made a feature. So instead of just weaving sort of haphazardly, I've gone with the structure that's here just to make it kind of cooler. And in this one, this was a threadbare area and it only had some minor holes. So it's much airier. You can see more of the original sock behind it because I was just darning over a threadbare area for the most part. But you can mix and match. That's what I did here. So on the occasional row, you can see like on this blue row here, there was a hole behind that. So I've added some additional yarn to strengthen it. So you don't have to just choose one or the other. It's a lot easier than stocking web darning or Swiss darning. And Scotch darning is stretchy, but only in one direction. So it stretches that way, but not that much that way. It's really good for socks and elbows, heels and elbows, because it's really hard wearing. And just by the way it's created, it's 3 times thicker than the yarn itself. So it's a good thing to keep in mind that it's going to be extra thick and extra sturdy. And so you wouldn't necessarily want to use it on something if you are sensitive, for example, or it's in a sensitive area, you might not want to use Scotch darning, or you might want to use a thinner yarn if you're going to do it. And here's one more example. This is a work in progress. So this is for my husband. He has these pineapple socks that he absolutely loves. And I created part of the pineapple. I recreated one, and now I'm just going to add the leaves using embroidery. So this was done with just yellow embroidery floss, and then I've added the little black stitches after the fact. So you can use that as your starting point and then kind of decorate something to make it match. So I'll just get started and show you how we do that. You can tell my husband loves fruit socks. Thank you, husband. for giving us something fun to look at. Now, I'm going to show you, this is another mushroom. This is a little teeny tiny one that sits on the table. I'm going to use this mushroom right now just because it's going to be easy to see underneath the sock. So when you are putting a sock on a mushroom, you want to make sure that it's mimicking the natural shape, but you don't want to stretch it. So what I don't want to do is that, because if I darn like that and then I remove the sock, it's going to end up all weird and puckery and loose afterwards. So I want this to be as close as possible to how it would sit if it was on my foot. And then I'm going to grab an elastic band, which just came off asparagus or something, I'm not sure. And I'm just going to secure it, and that'll hold it in place. You don't have to use the elastic band, but it's really good if you've got something that's in an awkward spot and you can't really get the tension right. It's also good if you get interrupted a lot. So you might have little kids, or you might have a noisy home environment, and you just want to make sure that you can actually easily pick up where you left off. And the elastic will help you with that because it means it's just sitting there waiting for you. So I'm going to use this yarn now, and I'm going to split it because I don't want the yarn to be this thick. So I'm just going to use, let's say, 3 strands. That's a really key part of using embroidery floss. You don't have to use all of it. That is a mistake I see a lot of people making when they start out. Maybe it's not a mistake, maybe it's a learning opportunity. We'll put it that way. But you want to match the yarn to the thickness of the item you're mending. And in the book, there's a section that I love called This Goes With That. And I show actual size photographs of the type of fabric you might want to mend and the right needles and yarn and fabric to mend them with. So it makes it really easy to figure that out. Now, for any kind of blanket stitch darning, I can just go ahead and use this embroidery floss as is. But if you were doing woven darning and you wanted to avoid that hazard, if you remember where we were showing all of these, how it's really hard to tell which row is which row, if you want to avoid that, you can wax your embroidery floss. This is one of my best tricks. So I just get beeswax, which you can get from your local beekeeper, or check, maybe you've got like a local honey company or something, and then I just drag the yarn over the wax and you can see the difference. So this one has been waxed and this one has not. So it just means that all the strands are properly coated and sit together, and there's no chance of me stitching through something by accident. I don't need to wax this in this example, but I did that just so you can see how it works. So now I'm gonna put that on there, thread the needle. Great. And then I'm going to start by, again, just putting this off to the side to keep it out of my way. So that's just going to keep it from annoying me and getting trapped in my work. And then I'm going to do running stitch all the way around just to create a border. So you don't have to do this step, but it makes it easier. And I also find that if you have a gigantic hole, like if you've got a gaping hole in your sock, you might find that doing this step shrinks up the hole a tiny bit and makes it more manageable. So I'm not pulling it tightly. I'm just securing this and saying this is where I want to start from. Sorry, get that back in frame. I'm looking at 3 cameras at the same time right now. It's very unnerving. Okay, come on. A little bit of cat hair to keep it real. And I'm just going to get this started. I'm conscious of the time. I've got about 8 minutes left, so if anyone has any questions, feel free to pop them through so I can make sure to get them answered. If you wanted a more defined line, like that pineapple that I showed, you can use backstitch to start this instead of running stitch, and it'll give it a more solid line. Okay, now I've got this here, and now I'm going to start doing blanket stitch. So I'm going to use that border that I just created as my starting point. And then I'm just going to make blanket stitches all the way around. And there is a full step-by-step set of pictures for all of these in the book in case you are missing any steps or curious how it works. I took all the photographs myself. My husband helped me create a special thing so that I could trigger the shutter on my camera with a remote control. And I took the pictures with my big toe. So my big toe pressed on the shutter remote, and that way I could have both my hands in the frame. So I could make sure that all of these things were mended in real time. I mended in front of the camera, and then I stopped and took a picture anytime I thought this is a really good thing to show people. So it's not just a case of a photographer thinking it looks pretty, it's actually me taking the photos myself and showing you exactly what you need to know. Okay, I'll just finish this row and then I'll show you the key step. And there's no sort of like, this is a very forgiving darning technique, and it's also faster than woven darning, probably faster than Swiss darning too, like if you've got a lot of damage. So my students really love this one. And it's really easy to add or remove stitches if you need to, or kind of just, it's a more meditative kind of soothing darning technique. Okay, so now I've made a complete pass all the way around the hole, and I'm just going to make my final stitch into the first stitch. So I'm going to do a complete round, a complete lap all the way around. Now, we have a hole. And if I just start creating blanket stitches from the existing stitches, it's either going to be really airy, which I don't want, especially if my big toe is always going to be popping out of this. It is possible, but there's a magic trick, and I'm going to show you the magic trick now, which is also in the book. So now I'm going to create some extra supports out of yarn. Usually about 4, but it doesn't really matter. It just kind of, you're just giving it a little bit extra padding so there's no air in there and there's no chance of your toe poking through, right? So you can see these little guys coming through. So now I'm going to start again from the beginning, and I'm going to use this existing blanket stitch as my starting point. So I'm going to go up here. Oh, sorry, I'll go. There we go. That's where I can get, so I've got my needle is picking up the blanket stitch above it, and it's also picking up this support here. So I'm getting double the thickness in my stitch. Now I'm going to pick up this one. Sorry, out of frame. Got it. So I'm picking up this blanket stitch and now some of the support bar. I'm pulling that through. As you get closer to the center, you will not need to pick up all of these blanket stitches. You can skip some. So it's really up to you. Use your best judgment. But the closer you get to the center, the smaller the circle gets and the fewer you need to actually collect. if I had not waxed this thread, normally I never wax thread when I'm doing Scotch darning or honeycomb darning. That was kind of an out of context thing I wanted to show you, a good trick. But if I had not waxed this thread, it would be far less sturdy and the threads would be kind of expanding to fill the space. So it would look much more natural and be much better coverage. The wax also comes out when you wash them. So it doesn't stay stiff like this forever. It's just really helpful for getting it done. So you can see now it's filling in that hole. And you just keep going all the way around until you get to the center. Now I'm just going to check the questions and see. Jean says they should teach darning in schools. Yes, I 100% agree. I wish if anyone is a teacher and they want to hire me to go teach in schools, I'm totally up for that. I love teaching kids. And someone said, I always wanted to know how to use a darning mushroom. Oh, good. Yes. Okay. And Jill says, darning for nearly 70 years and I taught her something. Oh my God, Jill, you just totally made my day. Or maybe that's my night, I guess. Yeah. Um, does anyone else have any questions? I've got about 2 or 3 minutes left to go. Let's put this back. I hope you enjoyed that. It's always fun darning live, and I feel very alive, like I'm flying by the seat of my pants. So, oh, Jean says I've explained it very well. Thank you, Jean. I love you. You're my new favorite person. There's also, I just want to point out a section of there's a section at the end of each chapter. So there's stitching, darning, patching, darning, and it's called What Could Go Wrong? This is one of my favorite sections of the book, and that's Anxious Frog. He's a little character that I created. So I have anticipated everything that could possibly go wrong. So if you have questions, if you're like, I don't think I got enough information, then I've already like anticipated what I think you're gonna want to know. Okay, Ellen says, how about darning fine knit fabrics? Ooh, that's a great question. So there with fine knit fabrics, especially if you want to go like invisible, then you definitely want a thinner yarn. That is the number one mistake that people make is using a yarn that is too thick. So if I'm going to darn super fine stuff, I'm just going to show you this. This is a collection of those little yarn bits that come with new clothing. So you might have seen these before. If you have this like on a sweater that you have purchased, you can use that. That is actually the original yarn. So some of these are quite fine. And you don't necessarily have to use the one that came with your sweater, but you can see like this one, that is extra fine. So these kinds of little odds and ends are perfect. You could also use lace weight knitting yarn if you wanted to darn with that. Or I would recommend this stuff, which I was using earlier. So I'll turn it right side up for you. But this is very, very thin, and you can use as many strands as you want. So if you are trying to darn something that's machine knit and you want like a super excellent invisible mend, you could use one strand of this. You don't have to use all 4 strands. So you can use it the same as embroidery floss and split it to however many you want. This is really good, and it's half wool and half acrylic. The other option is that you can take apart an old jumper and you can go ahead and unravel it and use the yarn from that. So there's all kinds of different options. There's also some cheat options in my book too. So if you don't want to darn, you might want to try needle felting, which everyone seems to really love. Or you might want to try, there's a tutorial in the book called Patch for Thin Socks. So if you find that your socks are super thin and all the yarn that you have is too bulky, you can just create a patch for them instead, which is a lot faster than having to darn them. So, ooh, Ellen darned her husband's undies. Yeah, I patched my husband's boxers. They're in the book. You're gonna love it. And Jean says, thanks for a great demo. Thank you so much, Jean.